Thank you so much. I really appreciate that very kind introduction. I am coming to you from Baltimore City, land belonging to the Lumbee, Piscataway, and Cherokee tribes. I am delighted to be here. This has been a difficult year. I often say, as I think about 2020, that 2020 was the year that tried to, but did not break us. It did not break us because we are still here. We're still trying to figure out this American experiment called democracy. We're still standing tall and resisting injustice, no matter how it shows up. I must note that I stand here today with a very broken heart when we think about Me Search. As I look at what happened this week with the verdict in the Chauvin trial, and while we were waiting for that, to find out about the murder of Ma'Khia Bryant, to know that yesterday the family of Dante Wright buried him, the 20-year-old that was killed in Minnesota, Ma'Khia Bryant, the 16-year-old that was shot and killed in Columbus, Ohio, and to think about the family of Adam Toledo, the 13-year-old that was shot in Chicago, understanding that the fight for justice is taking many different twists and turns. Do you know who you are? Do you know the gifts that you bring to the table? Do you know who sacrificed so that you could be here today? Who walked so that you could run? Whose shoulders do you stand on at this moment? Maya Angelou once said, I'm a black ocean, leaping and wide, wailing and swailing, I bear in the tide. Bearing the gifts my ancestors gave, I am the dream and the hope of the slave. Freedom fighter Ella Baker added to that when she said, give light and people will find the way. We live in a nation where we are struggling to survive and find the light. Next slide, please. Thank you. So the few areas I want to focus on today around active listening and intentional action gets us into this notion of Me Search. I believe that as scholars, we do a lot of research. We've learned how to do research. It's what we started doing when we were in elementary school. We had to go and write book reports or interview our family. We were doing research. We did it in middle school and in high school. We went through college, and if you have an advanced degree, your master's or your PhD or your EDD, it's about learning how to do research, pulling together all of the resources, primary sources and secondary sources, and figuring out where you stand in the material, being able to document where you're getting information from, being able to stand tall when you're challenged by your professor, when they ask you, where did you get that from? And you have your annotated bibliography to show them. That's the research that we've all become accustomed to. I would argue that over the last year, as we have been living through a global pandemic, if you are white, an Asian American, and if you are Latinx or African American, we've been living through a syndemic. And this notion of being in a syndemic, of having multiple points of oppression coming at us at one time, I believe forces us into a space where it is time to do some Me Search, where it's time to figure out exactly what am I doing here? Exactly what questions am I trying to answer? Exactly how do I find the space and the courage to practice active engagement, active listening, intentional action? How do I stand tall? And I also find moments to rest. Because I would argue that if 2020 didn't teach us anything else, is that it's exhausting fighting in this country against all of the odds that are coming against us. And so as we go into our conversation today around Me Search, I'd like to just put these questions out here that are on the screen, thinking about who are we? Taking that from a broad perspective, who are we either as a community, as a global gathering of scholars? Who are we as Black and brown and white folks in this country? Who are we as Americans? Like, what does it mean to fall within all of those groups? And then moving from who are we to who are you? Where do you fit into this? What are our results? What exactly are we trying to see happen in this country? I'm arguing that part of what we want is to move through this space where injustice is reigning into a space where equity and justice can live and can breathe. When are we going to see this happen? Many people believe that it would happen when we elected Barack Obama. I mean, I think about my grandmother who lay prostrate on the floor on the first time that Barack Obama was elected and telling me that she prayed him into office. But there was a sense that when Barack Obama got into office, he would, heal the dead, and he would, raise the sick, and he would walk on water. And what we found was the launch of the Black Lives Matter movement. And many thought that perhaps we would see the results as soon as we got Donald Trump out of office. And yet the injustice that we've been fighting against remains. Where are we going to see these results? Will we see them in our communities? Will we see them in legislation? Will we see them in the courthouses? Will we see them in ourselves? I mean, to me, that is really what research is about. Finding points of resistance so I can stand tall, even though the world may not change. I can be shifted and changed within it. And then how will we know them when we see them? Like, what does success look like for you? Well, what does it mean to reach that point where you can do what John Lewis talked about, where you can practice good trouble, but also remain in sound mind and body? Next slide, please. So going forward, I have just a number of quotes that are up on the screen, just to probe you into thinking about research that will help kind of guide the story that I have. Frederick Douglass is quoted here, but I want to go back because in 1851, Frederick Douglass argued that after 230 years of being chained and lashed, hunted with bloodhounds, and surrounded with utter insecurity, Frederick Douglass said that Black folks had learned how to live on and how to smile under it all. That we had learned how to sing through our pain, how to laugh through our tears, and even when we thought we made it over, we were reminded time and time again that America, the land of the free and the home of the brave, the place that opens its arms to the poor, huddled masses yearning to be free, the country that guarantees life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, had never been America to us. That is the poem that Langston Hughes talked about. America has never been America to me, but I swear that America will be. The reality is that we live in a country where we have been tormented, enslaved, and killed for the crime of being Black in America. We have borne witness as our neighborhoods have been terrorized, our children have been scarred and seared, our sisters and brothers have been violated and incarcerated. We understood, even if we could not articulate it, that the only reason that white America has stood tall was that it forced everyone else to kneel down so that white America could stand on our backs. It was that way in the beginning, and it's that way today. And yet we have survived. That research shows us that we are the descendants of people who chose to survive, and that survival instinct has been carrying us this far. It carried us when we first arrived on this shore, unsure of what our future would be in this new land that was held before us. It carried us through over 200 years of slavery, of whips and chains on the backs of people like Harriet Tubman and Nat Turner, during a time when you can see the hand that held the chain that was attached to the ball that was tied to your ankle. It carried us through the Civil War and Reconstruction and Jim Crow, where we taught our children the unwritten rules that were marked by our blood, and we survived anyway. I would argue that as Americans, and however you define that we are a long-willed and stubborn people. We've survived sharecropping and the period called the Nadir, the Great Depression, Vietnam, Reaganomics, and crack cocaine. We survived Donald Trump, right? And we are stubborn and we are strong-willed people. Next slide, please. Coretta Scott King talks about how freedom is never really won. and that you have to win it and you have to earn it in every generation. That the central point of how I look at me search today is noting how every conversation is a conversation about race, even when it's not. Because conversations about race are not about race, they are about people. And conversations about people are messy. They're hard to adjust to. They're hard to come to grips with because you have to challenge yourself about how you're going to go forward. Race, of course, is not a biological concept. It is a social construct that either extends or denies access to the room, as Lin-Manuel Miranda said, to the room where it all happens. Who is invited to be in the room, and that once you get in the room, do you sit comfortably at the table without holding the door open for other people to get through? Now, there's some dispute about the origins of the word race, and many researchers claim that William Dunbar used it first. Back in 1508, he had a poem called The Backbiters of Sundry Races. And when he used race then, he was talking about race in terms of a kinship group, right? As kinfolk coming together. That definition of race then is not our definition of race today. In this country, we have a racial cloud that hangs over America. And any starting point of me search, you got to go through that cloud. And depending upon where you stand, then you have to think about Kimberly Crenshaw's idea around intersectionality, because every point of oppression in your life is another cloud that you have to walk through. So if you are a Black person, if you are Asian American, if you are Hispanic, if you are Indigenous, that's a cloud that you walk through around this point of race. If you are a woman, if you're someone who does not subscribe to these two genders of man and woman, then you have another cloud that you're walking through. If you're economically challenged in this country, that's another cloud that you are walking through. Depending upon your education level, that's a cloud. Depending upon whether or not you are transgender, that's a cloud. Depending upon whether or not you are same-sex preference, it becomes a cloud because there's a circle of privilege. So any point of me search has to take you through the point of intersectionality to come to grips with all of these points where it's designed to other you. And that part of the work that we do is we unpack the othering and we break what we call the circle of privilege. Next slide. I pulled this one up because when I think about the impact of Black Lives Matter meets Black COVID stories within a year that was designed to break us but did not, I think about the fact that it was during last year's moments when we saw the video footage of Black people being killed on screen, when we heard the story around Breonna Taylor, that for a number of people, that was an awakening moment. It was, the deep giant that had been asleep coming to life. But for people who had been living in that space, who have been wrestling with what it means to be a person of color in America, and that wrestling is something that has taken place. If we look at Nikole Hannah-Jones's work at the 1619 Project, we go back to that. Now, I do want to know, because I always have to be very clear, I'm from South Carolina. And growing up in South Carolina, we were not taught 1619. We were taught 1444, which is when you had enslaved people under Spanish rule, in South Carolina. But we're going to go with 1619 because that's the first time that enslaved, captured Africans were connected with permanent settlements in Jamestown, Virginia. So it would take almost 45 years after that, in 1661, before Virginia did something very interesting that changed the trajectory of what it meant to be Black in America. Because American enslavement at that point was not chattel slavery. It was not from the womb to the grave. It was on indentured contracts. It was serving out your time. It was being able to be enslaved without having it extend to your entire family. In 1661, Elizabeth Key, an enslaved woman, sued for her freedom and the freedom of her son. What she had found, because she could read, she had found that in Virginia, as in the other colonies, they followed English common law. And under English common law, you received your legal status from your father and not your mother. Her mother was an enslaved African woman. Her father was a European. And so she sued for her freedom and the freedom of her son. And she won in 1661. That was Elizabeth Key. But in 1662, that was the moment that Angela Davis said shifted everything. Because in 1662, Virginia's House of Burgess, and I always say Virginia's gonna Virginia, of course, they put something in place called Partus Sequitur Ventrum, which means they changed English common law. They rejected English common law and said from that point on, your legal status came from your mother and not your father. So if you were born in the womb of an enslaved woman, you were born enslaved and you remained enslaved your entire life from the womb until the grave. Angela Davis said it was at that moment that America's economic system became connected to the wombs of Black women, that there was uncontestable access to the bodies of Black women to be able to rape and impregnate Black women with impunity to build up your economic base. Research has to start with understanding how your body is tied to this land, how your ability to have children connects to the economic structure, how then you tie in to the economic foundation of America, and why it was, according to Ira Berlin, that we moved from being a society with slaves, where slavery was one of the many forms of economic progress in this country, to becoming a slave society, where slavery sat in the center of how America was being built and lived out. Next slide, please. This notion of how history has made us who we are and how we are shaped by the situations that have happened around us, that we understand that, like James Baldwin said, we have to begin again. I don't think that this notion of trying to figure out who we are and where we stand in this moment is something that we ever move through. We are not going to move through it until the nation moves through it. Because even if you individually get to a place where you're saying, I can get beyond race, I can get beyond this situation, we are reminded in just the situations that have happened in the past week and a half alone, that the nation has to get beyond this, even when we get to a place where we are settled with this. It was back in 1967 where President Lyndon Baines Johnson, if you remember, it was right after the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and what they found was the burning of communities in 1967. Now, I tend to use the term riot as Dr. King describes it, right? That a riot is a language of the unheard. In 1967, there was a sense that nobody was listening to Black folks in the communities. Even with the Civil Rights Act, even with the Voting Rights Act, there were communities that were on fire in 1967. It was happening so much that Lyndon Baines Johnson organized the commission to find out what was going on. Now, I like to paraphrase it. You may disagree. I like to paraphrase it. That LBJ wanted the Kerner Commission, all these white men, go find out what Black folks want so they can stop burning down the communities and we can shut them up. Like, what do they want? So we can figure out how to give it to them and we can move this country along the path that I have laid out. The Kerner Commission worked from the fall of 67 up until the spring of 68. And 1 month before Dr. King was assassinated, as many of you know, they released this Kerner Commission where they talked about how America was becoming two societies, right? One white, one Black, separate and unequal. I bring that up because when we look at that and we look at what the Kerner Commission laid out, and I'm going to paraphrase the three things they said that, if we give this to the Black community, this is a way that we can have freedom. This is a way that we can bring things together if we do three things. If we pour money into the Black communities, into the neighborhoods. Do understand that by the time 1967 had happened, you had already had the racial restrictive codes of 1910 that started here in Baltimore City that really separated the communities based upon race, like redlined, predominantly Black, economically challenged communities and set them up as concrete jungles. They also said you should pour money into the schools. I understand by 1967, we were still dealing with the aftermath of the 1954 Brown v. Board decision that was supposed to bring equality in all the schools, but we understand that did not happen, that there was a fight to really have the laws in force. And then third, they said, let's close the wage pay gap. Let's make sure that Black folks are making on par with their white colleagues. If we do these three things, then we can bring this nation together. And Lyndon Baines Johnson rejected it. The study was redone in 1998 by the Eisenhower Foundation, 30 years later. They went back, they looked at what the Kerner Commission said. They said, okay, so where are we now? It's 1998. Has the country moved forward since then? It's been 30 years. There are more Black folks graduating from high school and graduating from college, in jobs, working for the government. Have we moved closer together when it comes to race relations? And the Eisenhower Foundation in 1998 found that we had not. They said there are three things that we can do, though. Again, they said if you pour money into the Black communities, and what you do is you put in green spaces, you make them safe communities, you get rid of what we call these fast food swamps and fresh fruit deserts so people can be comfortable in their neighborhoods. If you pour money into the schools within the inner city and bring them up to par with their county counterparts, and you close the wage pay gap, you make sure that Black and brown folks are on par with white folks in this country. If you do that, we can close this gap. They said, because right now, in 1998, America is Blacker and browner and poorer and more separated than it's ever been in 1998. And then finally, it was redone in 2018. In 2018, they said, let's go back. It's 50 years since the Kerner Commission. They put together a diverse panel to see whether or not the country had moved forward. And I don't have to remind you of what was happening in 2018 with the number of people calling the cops on Black folks for just living our lives and brown folks for just living our lives, and who was president in 2018. But they found that Black folks and brown folks were still separated from the white community, and that the gap had gotten bigger. And that in order to close that gap, they laid out a number of things that could happen to bring this nation together. But the three I want to focus on are the same three that they put in 68 and the same three they put in 1998. Pour monies into the Black community. Make them into safe spaces. Pour money into the inner city schools. Bring the schools up to the level where they are on par, and then close the wage pay gap. That it makes no sense that in this country, that Black folks and brown folks and women of all races and ethnicities are still making less money on a dollar than our white male and Asian American male counterparts. That study, of course, was not picked up. It was more research that was laid on the table and not the me-search that needed to happen to explain the quantitative data. What is the toil on the soul to be in communities that are behind? What exactly does it mean? And we saw that play out in 2020. We actually saw the cost for all three of these things not to happen, and what ended up taking place in the Black and brown community, where we watched Black and brown folks who had been invisible labor in this country move to being essential labor. And then, of course, what it meant is they were disposable labor. Next slide, please. And so looking at what Charles Chesnutt said, and this notion that impossibilities around the things in which you have learned and the things that you don't wish to happen, what does it mean to make the impossible possible? What does it mean to challenge yourself, to do things differently? Ta-Nehisi Coates said that race is the child of racism and not the father. I add to that and said, well, if that is the case, then racism itself is the offspring of white supremacy and whiteness, because racism is what holds up white supremacy and whiteness, not in terms of white people, but in terms of the centering of whiteness as a point of privilege. That needs to be dismantled in order for us to have the freedom, equality, and equity that is needed. That Me Search is telling us as we look at what is woven into the fabric of America, that the only way that we can get the type of equity and justice that we are desperately seeking is we have to pull on a thread and we have to unravel it and understand that conversations that start with race are really conversations that go deeper into people and then goes into conversations really about us and where do we sit with these issues. Next slide, please. That as we go forward, thinking about fear, and I think about Nina Simone, James Baldwin said we have to step into the fear. He said that there's a continuum around race because our history is not the past. Our history is the present. We carry our history with us because we are our history. I have always had kind of a confusing relationship around race. I am the daughter of he's both a pastor and a civil rights movement leader. Like my dad occupied both spaces and he took both of those things into the home. And that's how he shaped us to understand like where we sit. And I've been wrestling with these questions around who I am and who I want to be. I would say since I was 7. I use 7 as the main point for me because I was 7 years old when I had my first conversation about race. Now, I noted earlier that I grew up in South Carolina. I spent my summers in South Carolina and I spent my winters in Washington, D.C. I went to school in Washington, D.C. And I remember I would come home from D.C. and I would get straight in the car. My dad would take us right on down to my grandmother's home, which is where we would spend our summers. And I would play with the kids in the neighborhood. My father's mother lived on a farm in Lexington, South Carolina, the farm that our family received when slavery ended. We're one of the few families that actually received the 40 acres and the mule and the $50. And that's heir property that's remained in our family since then. All of our neighbors were family members, and we would spend half the summer there running through the forest. We were picking cotton. We were just being free in our space, really protected from the reality of what it meant to be in the South and be a Black person. The other half of the summer, I would stay with my mother's mother, and she lived in Columbia. And she was one of the first Black nurses in South Carolina. They were, upper middle class. They lived on an integrated block in South Carolina. And I would run down and I would play with a neighborhood boy. He was 4 houses down on the left. And we started playing together. I'm thinking we were 3 or 4 years old. I don't even remember how long we played together. It was part of what I did. Get out of the car, run down to my friend's house, even before we had unpacked. When I was younger, they would walk me down there. So I was 7. And I remember the day when he was upset talking about the Yankee N-words. Now, I will not say the word, but he did. We were 7, right? So he's talking about the Yankee N-words and he's kicking a can, hands in his pocket. He was upset about how his father was really angry about the Yankee N-words coming down from the North, trying to take over, and that the South was going to rise again, and that if he had his way, all the Yankee N-words would be blown away, and that he hated the Yankee N-words. And so my friend at 7, little white kids, like, I hate the N-words. I do. I didn't really know what that meant. And I was like, well, I hate them too. I was like, yes, we all hate them. And I remember running home and telling my Nana, because I'm like, she needs to hate them as well. And I told her, I was like, these Yankee N-words, and I'm trying to tell her the whole story. I remember her retelling me the story that I told her and how upset I was about the Yankee N-words. And like 2 things happened that day. One, that was the last time that I played with my friend down the street. Later, my Nana told me that she stopped me from going down there, saying if his father was that angry with the Yankee N-words, then it would only take a small step to where his anger would come out against me. And the second thing is that was my first conversation about race, where my Nana spoke to me about the notion of race, first as a concept outside of me, race happening in the greater environment, and then second as a conversation that took place inside me. Where do I sit with this question? Now, I didn't have answers at the age of 7, But I've been wrestling with that question ever since. What does it mean to be Black in America? What does it mean to be a Black woman in America? What does it mean to be a Black mother in America? And what does it mean to deal with all of this in the midst of a global pandemic? What does it mean to deal with all this in the midst of a syndemic? What does it mean to deal with all of this without fear to get to a place where I can continue to fight for equity and justice? What exactly does that mean? And how am I struggling with it? Next slide, please. And so knowing that America is tragically flawed, as Dr. Asante kind of lays out here, knowing that we're built on the backs of a system where oppression and servitude of Black bodies, what was the norm, not the exception, knowing that African descendants of enslaved men and women helped to build this country that's built upon racism, the parent of race, that is woven into every facet of our lives, and it shows up in everything. Understand that it shows up in the mass industrial prison complex, where Black folks are not the majority anywhere else in this country except within the mass industrial prison complex, which reared its ugly head and began to get formed after American slavery ended. No one shows up in police brutality, understanding that the KKK and the police department are uniquely tied to one another. And prior to 1869, they were uniquely tied to the point where it was the KKK acting as the police and doing the policing in the communities. Knowing it shows up not just in the redlining of our community, but also in the mortgages by banks. What happens with us being able to own our own homes, the first step towards generational wealth building. It shows up in voter suppression. I think all of us are aware of what's happening in Georgia and what we saw with the latest election. It shows up through racial profiling, through this notion of being seen as being guilty, adultification of our children who are not allowed to have a childhood. It shows up in the racist practices happening in schools, where we see a higher exposure rate of Black and brown children in public schools and a lower per pupil funding amount set in inner city schools. We know that it shows up as the backbone of our country. It shows up in our economic system. In 2016, the net worth of a typical white family was $171,000. And the net worth for a typical Black family was $17,150. That the ratio of white family wealth to Black and brown family wealth the ratio is much higher today than at the start of the century. It also shows up in our medical field. When you think about what happened with the 1932 Tuskegee syphilis study, which for a lot of Black folks, that's still a part of their reality. I mean, if you are the child, as I am, of anyone from the last Jim Crow generation, they remember Tuskegee and they talk about Tuskegee as if it was yesterday. If you're from the Baltimore area, you think about Henrietta Lacks and the Black woman whose cells were stolen from her. And Hopkins has built a multi-trillion-dollar business on the back of the HeLa cells. It shows up in the common misconception that's still talked about today that Black folks have a higher tolerance for pain than our white counterparts. And we see that showing up because Black women are 4 times more likely than white women to die from pregnancy-related complications. Today, more Black women are dying during childbirth than at the latter half of slavery. When COVID-19 hit its peak last year, more Black people actually got infected with COVID-19. Black women were the highest amounts to get affected, but Black men were the highest amount dying from COVID-19. More Black women contracted and died from COVID-19 than white men and Asian American men in this country. Black folks accounted for 25% of those who have tested positive and 39% of those who have died from COVID-19, even though we're only 13.1 to 14% of the general population. Next slide. My mother calls it a never-ending nightmare where Black people die first and die more. And that part two of that nightmare is where brown people, that's both Hispanic and indigenous people, die first and die more. And so the conversations around race and around gender and around class are the conversations around research. You cannot separate who we are in this society and who you are in this society from where we're going. So what do we do now? How do we come to grips with this? How do we solve it? How do we end it? How do we, as my son would say, stop the ride and get off? Like, how do we say that me search calls upon us to be both anti-racist and anti-sexist, and to not practice anti-blackness or anti-brownness? That is calling upon us to see ourselves differently and then to see the world differently. Next slide, please. That it is calling upon us to take that next step, as Angela Davis says, that if we are going to commit ourselves to changing this country, to actually getting to the root of what it is that makes this country run in the way that it runs, we're going to say that we're in it for a lifetime. We're going to say that every point of oppression we're going to struggle with, and we're going to struggle through. Now, I want to note that what is very difficult about this is that the struggle to be free and the struggle to come to grips with this is something that can keep you up at night. Like, I am telling you that every time I fall into this space, and every time I think about the fact that this struggling space that we're in has not ended, not just from racism as a whole, even just narrowing it down to police brutality. And I bring that up because everyone's been so focused on police brutality now that we were involved with the Derek Chauvin trial. But just noting that last year in 2020, during the global pandemic, when everybody was shut in, police officers from January to June, they shot and killed a Black person every week in all 48 states except for Rhode Island and Vermont. Like, the reality of that should stop you. That since the Chauvin trial, 75 unarmed people have been shot and killed by the police. The reality of that should stop us in our tracks. Knowing that, where do we deal with the struggle and still deal with healing and still deal with moving forward? Next slide, please. And so this is where I'll end and invite the conversant up on the stage with me. But that I believe that we have a job here. And I put students, but I add colleagues, I add family members, I add our children, that we have to spark the genius of everyone around us, set them on fire, and let them loose into the world to radically transform it. Let me tell you where that comes from. That comes from Dr. Carter G. Woodson. They call him the father of Black history. He is the founder of the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, ASALH, but he also founded Negro History Week that became Black History Week, that's now Black History Month. Carter G. Woodson, in his book, The Miseducation of the Negro, says we've got to spark the genius. That there's something about sparking that genius, setting people on fire, and then setting them loose, go forward, radically transform the world. I am saying that part of me search, the essential part, is you got to find your spark. You got to find what gets your heart moving. You got to find the areas that move you forward. And part of it is knowing that you are not designed to do everything. What did Oprah say? You can do 1,000 things, just not at one time. That every single struggle doesn't need your presence. Every single march, you don't have to show up. Every single yard sign, you don't have to get. Finding your space and giving yourself time to rest. Knowing that resistance and courage are uniquely tied to one another, that when you find your spark and you find what moves you forward, what gets you up in the morning, what drives you, like, you feed that flame. And then you give yourself moments to rest, because the struggle is going to continue. It's like Schubert's Unfinished Symphony. The fire and music of racism has been burning and playing long before we got here. I think that our job in this moment is to disrupt the flames, to disrupt the music, and then just make whatever shifts we can. And so that things will get a little bit better and move down the path a little bit farther for the next generation to come behind us. Thank you so much. You can bring the slides down now.
Okay, I just unmuted my mic. You know, Doctor, it was a beautiful presentation. I feel like you just taught my entire 16th class in one presentation on African American history. But I want to pick your brains here. What you talk about as the cloud, I'm an interdisciplinary historian, and I am originally from Louisiana, from small town Louisiana. And so many of us here at this conference and in Wisconsin are Black and brown bodies in the diaspora. Away from where we are, we're in predominantly white institutions. Often, many of us are the onlys in our areas. And that comes with that cloud you talk about, that cognitive overload, that the price of the double consciousness. So as we fight that cloud, I know that I have found that the thing that creates the most havoc for me is the literal implicit bias that some majority people have, where they are literally looking at the video. And I'm only 90 miles from Minneapolis right now, so we get spillover. They literally look at the video and then they deny the reality that we literally see. And because there are so many and there are so few of us, it creates doubt in our mind. So as you were asking us, I mean, I call it the what do I want to be when I grow up question. So as you ask us to that of ourselves, I ask, how can we take this research we do to save ourselves? How can we apply it out there in a world that literally, where the people who are invested in racism and power really cannot see us? They literally cannot see us. And I think that is part of that cognitive overload that we as educators have.
Yeah,
So
I would,
it's wisdom there.
no, I think it's interesting that you said that, because the gaslighting, as you mentioned, is very real. That there is a sense that our pain has been used for profit. And I want to separate the question out kind of into three spaces. And so space one is around the not believing our own lying eyes, right? Which is something they say in the church. Your eyes are lying to you. You're not really seeing what you think you're seeing. And this society has done that. I think when we think about 1991 and the beating of Rodney King, we saw the video and the police officers were not indicted. So we were told not to believe our lying eyes. We saw the body of Mike Brown in the street in Black Lives Matter 1.0. We saw the video of Tamir Rice, and we saw police officers walking away and not being held accountable, being told, don't believe your lying eyes, that this is not something, even though you're seeing death, Philando Castile, even though you're looking at the pictures with Corinne Gaines, don't believe your lying eyes, which is the ways in which the Black body has been sacrificed in this country, the ways in which the brown body has been sacrificed in this country so often that we are not even shocked. Now, we may be in pain from it, but then we have to try to convince other people who are not of color that our pain is real. That's exhausting. And may I add with the cloud, the other point around gaslighting is the notion of being a Black woman or a brown woman and watching Black and brown women being attacked. And then we have gaslighting from our own community, that we can all stand in solidarity as Black folks around George Floyd, as we should, around Tamir Rice. But then we have questions about Ma'Khia Bryant. We have questions about Corinne Gaines, that we tend to say, well, as Black women, what was she doing to justify this happening? That's an additional form of gaslighting that we deal with as folks who gender identify as women in this space. So that's one kind of circle. A second circle is the ways in which white corporate America has found to capitalize off our pain. That Black Lives Matter is a moneymaker. And that's what's so disturbing about it. So they know, CNN, C-SPAN, you can name them all. They know if they put the George Floyd video out there, we're going to be shocked. We're going to gasp, but we're going to keep watching. That George Floyd video of a man being murdered on film was watched 1.4 billion times since last year. And when the trial started of Derek Chauvin, 50 million people watched it again that day. It's a moneymaker. And so we can profit off of Black Lives Matter. We can have tennis shoes with the Black Lives Matter slogan on it. You know, we can pour $90 million into the Black Lives Matter Global Foundation at a time when Black folks are losing their job and we don't see a direct translation of the money into our communities. Black Lives Matter is another piece, and that's being used to gaslight us. Like, it's when we say Black Lives Matter and you see it on a t-shirt that sells for $15 that's sold in, Heckinger Mall, I'm using it as an old mall, that's a very different sense of Black Lives Matter. That Black Lives Matter for people doesn't extend to Black folks not making a dollar on a dollar. It doesn't extend to our schools not having the resources so our children can learn during a global pandemic. It doesn't extend to the fact that Black folks were out driving the bus, stocking the shelves, running the medicine, and dropping off packages while everybody else had the ability and the privilege to stay at home. That Black Lives Matter didn't extend to all of that. And then a third space that I think we have to talk about is the implicit bias of our own colleagues. That when educated folks want to help explain it away, research it away, what they're really doing is they're trying to just erase us away. That when you say you don't see color, it's actually an offense to say that. When you say yes, but, it's an offense to say that. It is the sacrificing of Black and brown bodies, which I would argue, sister, becomes a sacrifice of the Black and brown spirit. Because I'm here, but how is my spirit being attacked in this moment when I not only have to carry the pain of George Floyd, and I think about that because in the courtroom when the verdict was read, the family of Emmett Till was there. And they've never received justice for what happened to Emmett Till in 1955. Rodney King's family was in the courtroom. Breonna Taylor's boyfriend was in the courtroom. All of them were there, not because they're connected to George Floyd, because they just wanted to witness, hopefully, finally, the system working the way it was supposed to. Not with justice, but with accountability is all we were asking for. And the fact that in the three circles that I laid out, all we're ever asking for is to be seen, is to actually have our lives matter across the board, not for a slogan, not for babynames.com, not for the Amazon statement, but in the essential totality of how we live out our lives and our experience in this country.
Hear me?
I can hear you now.
Okay. Let's pick up on the unseen and the seen and what you said about this commodification of Black lives with the Black Lives Matter movement. The irony is that where we're seeing effectiveness and power, Stacey Abrams and the Moral Mondays movement down in the South. And the groups that are affiliated with them in the North are the ones who are actually pushing the legislation. But the media ignores our effective self-help and ignores what we're doing to build wealth and focuses on Black Lives Matter because they can create controversy, they can misrepresent them, and they can sell on Black Lives Matter. They don't think they can sell on Stacey Abrams. They don't think they can sell on Reverend Barbara and Reverend Theo Harris. It's in part because Reverend Theo Harris and them are still doing that assimilated respectability politics thing. They ask us to be assimilated, they ask us to be respectable, and when we do it, they still don't see us. And then they go look for what they can stereotype so they can rile up segregated whites against us. Does this make sense, what I'm saying?
Yes, it does.
And
Yes, it does.
so this commodification of Black pain, it is what it feels like has accelerated during the pandemic. And for those of us in these predominantly white spaces, we have that burden of gaslighting on top of us, and we have the burden of trying to be the support for our students. How become effective and keep ourselves from going crazy? Or from slapping a colleague into the wall when they say something stupid? Because we've all had that moment.
I think so. I am laughing because we know that as we go forward and the ways in which we find the moments to stand tall, that we have to find a space where we are not allowing ourselves to become the commodity. I think that is what is interesting because as something you noted earlier, that we exist as Black and brown professors in predominantly white and persistently white spaces. So are we the commodity? Have we gotten commodified? Are we saying that the ways in which we move forward is a part of how we are working through what it means to be a part of this country? It is difficult for us to think about it. Now, when you look at Stacey Abrams, who I, as most people, I have a lot of respect for. What I like about Stacey Abrams, that instead of just picking up her toys and going home, when a system was unfair and unjust toward her, that she mobilized. But we understand that in this country, any periods of mass mobilization by Black and brown folks will be followed by a white lash that's typically around voter suppression or around violence. Like, let's be very clear. This is where we are in this country. When American slavery ended, the 13th Amendment was ratified, and they started talking about citizenship for Black folks. By 1868, they said, look, we're going to work this thing out where Black folks are going to be pulled into this system. You saw the rise of white supremacy. There was no need for white supremacy before slavery ended. You saw the rise of the KKK. You saw the rise in the number of lynchings. You saw the push to silence Black people, to follow up progress with this white lash. And every time we've moved in this country, the backlash has been a white lash. We saw it with Barack Obama's presidency most recently. What was the white lash? The election of Donald Trump. Let's be very clear. We saw it with the election of Joe Biden. What was the white lash? What's happening in Atlanta, Georgia right now, and Georgia as a whole, along with the other 274 bills across the country around voter suppression. Are we the commodities? Are we for sale? And if we're not, then what does that call upon us to do? How do we resist in the spaces where we find ourselves? I'm also at a PWI, and I wrestle with this every single day, saying, I get up in the morning and I take my time, my talent, and my treasure. That's because I'm a PK, right? I take my time, talent, and treasure to a predominantly persistently white institution's grasp. That is where I'm spending all of my time, giving all of my talent, using all of my treasures. How is that helping to advance my people? And I have to think about, what does it mean to practice resistance in this space? And for me, it was the founding of the Carson Institute for Race, Peace, and Social Justice. I founded that in October, and I did something that has never been done at a Jesuit institute. I named it after my daddy. I'm like, if I'm gonna do this institution and you want me to do it here, I want it named after my father. Like, I want to have a Black man's name at an institution that's on the space of a persistently white campus. Resistance has to come in all forms and shapes and sizes.
Well, let me extend that, in that if for us who are at these PWIs, it's not just the administration, it's that the community expects us to lead.
Yes.
And we have these clashing expectations where the community wants us to do this service. The community wants us to explain things. The community wants us to educate those who don't want to be educated. And the administration expects us to assimilate, to do research that will please the white academy. The white academy tries to set standards on brown stories, to engage with other faculty who will sometimes refuse our expertise, or will intellectualize our pain and intellectualize our right to exist. How can we balance, in some ways, the expectation? For me, I know I used my research into the Deacons for Defense and Justice and into Black soldiers, and I apply those lessons to the community work that I do. But I also make sure the community people go back and yell at my dean and my provost, so that they are reminded that the Wisconsin idea is we're to take this research out into the community. We're not supposed to be in the ivory tower and do add-a-brick stuff. But before people, you know what I'm talking about. For the people who are in very small communities here, taking it out into the community also makes you vulnerable.
Right.
And adds to your cognitive dissonance. We have a very strong and very loud and very dangerous set of new clan here. 3%ers in Kenosha and where I am.
Yeah.
How do we balance this and still keep ourselves sane?
So I think that there comes a point when you're going to have to make a decision about who you want to be in this space. Now, prior to Black Lives Matter 1.0, the decision I made was, I'm a historian. I focus on Black women's history from the 19th century. I said my goal is to be in the archives. Darlene Clark Hine, Rosalind Terborg Penn have laid the path for me to spend my days in the archives reclaiming the words and the work and the lives of 19th century Black women. That's where I was. That's how I came into the academy. That was my focus. That was my book, Notes from a Color Girl. Diaries from a Black woman who lived from 1863 to 1865, a little collection of her diaries. When Trayvon Martin was killed and George Zimmerman was not sent to jail for his murder, I had to sit down and I had to look my own sons in the face. And I made a decision. Not everyone does, but I made a decision at that moment that I can't stay in the archives if my sons can't get home safe. I cannot do this. It does. I said, even if it means I'm never going to get tenure, even if it means I have to leave the university, I'm doing this work. And I switched everything. My work moved from the diaries of Emily Francis Davis. My next book was Letters to My Black Sons. Like, I moved into Black mothering as both a practice and a praxis for me. I became a scholar activist. I'm like, you know what? I started writing op-eds for the local paper because I'm like, you know what? No one's reading my book. I need the racists over in Dundalk to read my work. I'm gonna put it in the Baltimore Sun. They can read it with their coffee. So I started doing op-eds. I started doing community gatherings. I started moving into that space. Now my university worked with me and I got tenure, but I am a public intellectual. I have a daily radio show doing, and to me it's the biggest classroom I could get because all I do in my radio show is exactly what I do now. And I have a lot of racists who listen to my show. They call and they tell me how much they hate me, right? I'm like, you hate me, but you're listening every day. So I know that if I continue to put coffee drops into your mug, at some point we're going to have a full cup here because something's going to get through. But that is a choice that I had to make, even if it meant sacrificing tenure, because I'm the mother of Black sons. And you know what? I can do all these academic books, but if my sons can't drive home, if my son can't walk home, then I cannot go forward. Because in the end, that's who I have to answer to, and not my tenure committee. I made that choice. Not everybody can. But I'm in the streets all the time because I made that choice. I write a column for the Afro. I mean, this is what I do. People know if they look at my work, I'm a public intellectual, every sense of the word. My work is written not for my academic scholarly friends. My work is written for the guy in Dundalk. And the guy in Dundalk, maybe just to finish high school, you're going to be able to read my stuff. We ain't going to be no words in there. I'm not using 25-cent words. I'm using nickel words because what I'm trying to do is get to the hearts and minds of people. And that is a ground that an academic book won't help, but an op-ed, a community gathering, a radio show, being a scholar activist will.
And for that, we only have 40 seconds left.
I see the counter.
It is so hard to put ourselves out, but to remember that our intellectualism is not for each other. It is to deal with the guy in Dunkirk. Here, it would be that guy in Barron. And I know the cognitive overload of that, and I know the double burden of that. So thank you. Thank you so much for your words of wisdom, and thank you for being here.
Thank you very much. I put into the chat, I put my email address and I put the Carson Institute's website. Reach out to me. I would love to continue the conversation. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's been a pleasure and an honor to be here.